As your Lordship pleases. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Professor, if you would turn to page, let me give you the file number, file 12, page 1047. Is that where you are?
Yes, yes.
We pick up where we left off yesterday. This is an article, Cannabis Use in Palliative Oncology, a review of the evidence for popular indication. Now, I'll read the abstract. It has a dark background. It'll be easier for me to read it than you.
Thank you.
A flowering plant of variegated ingredients and psychoactive qualities, cannabis has long been used for medicinal and recreational purposes. Currently, cannabis is approved in several countries for indications of symptomatic alleviation. However, limited knowledge on the benefits and risks precludes inclusion of cannabis in standard treatment guidelines. This review provides a summary of the available literature on the use of cannabis and cannabinoid-based medicines in palliative oncology. Favorable outcomes are demonstrated for chemotherapy, induced nausea and vomiting, and cancer-related pain, with evidence of advantageous neurological interactions. Benefit in the treatment of anorexia, insomnia, and anxiety is also suggested. Short and long-term side effects appear to be manageable and to subside after discontinuation of the drug. Finally, cannabinoids have shown anti-neoplastic effects in preclinical studies in a wide range of cancer cells and some animal models. Further research is needed before cannabis can become part of evidence-based oncology practice. The conclusion that they come to, if one reads at page 1049, is cohort studies have added support to the growing body of knowledge on cannabis use in palliative oncology. However, these studies have many limitations. Promising data on pain, nausea, and vomiting relief, as well as a relatively favorable safety profile and potential anti-cancer properties, will allow for more focused research in the future. Meanwhile, basic clinical trials are needed to find the right constellation of drug composition, dose and means of administration to tailor specific cannabis-based medicine per indication and per patient. With evolving legislation, improved education and training, and increasing availability, medical cannabis is back in the limelight and gradually integrating into standard evidence-based oncology practice. Now, I know that it is Dr. Abrams who is a specialist in this field, and he will give evidence, no doubt, in due course. But my point is that from this piece of literature and its reference to all the other literature and its findings, there's been a tremendous amount of research in the realm of the use of cannabis and oncology, and more particularly in the palliative phase of life, stage 3 and 4 cancer onwards. Would that be correct?
Well, there's been a lot of research, yes. I'm not an expert across the range, so...
This is outside of your field, which is the brain, and this relates to...
Well, it relates to some aspects. Whether it's more in palliative 3 and 4 than the other, I'm not sure, but there's certainly a lot of evidence, as you see from this paper.
But it's in this realm that there's been a lot of anecdotal information from people, and then research done in the medical research community.
Indeed.
That's my point.
This paper does show a considerable amount of research.
If you could turn then to page 1051. This is taken from, it's an article from the Hazeldean Betty Ford Institute for Recovery Advocacy, dealing with, of course, the Betty Ford organizations deal with addiction, as you know. This one is titled, Harmful Drinking Patterns, a Persistent Cause for Concern. And I think by this time you understand that we are ad idem, that the effects of alcoholism are also problematic in society.
Yes.
So maybe I should just, for fairness to yourself, nonetheless read it. Just read the first paragraph under overview. Alcohol is a major contributor to mortality and morbidity in the United States. An estimated 88,000 people die each year from alcohol-related causes, making it the fourth leading cause of preventable deaths. A recent analysis of national data showed the alcohol-related emergency department visits as increasing at a faster rate than overall emergency department visits, placing a huge burden on the already stressed healthcare system. Currently, there are nearly 4 million alcohol-related emergency department visits per year in the United States, representing a significant increase since 2001. And it then refers to binge drinking and binge thresholds. But what I want to take you to is over the page at 1052, where under the second heading, excessive drinking goes hand in hand with other drug use, including marijuana, the following is said: decades of research studies support the notion than students who do not use marijuana. Excessive drinking behavior is associated with a higher risk of smoking cigarettes and using other illicit drugs as well. Do you accept that finding?
I accept the association. People who use alcohol are more likely to use other drugs. That is true.
Well, their finding here is that
This seems to be the other way around.
other way around.
Sorry?
Speaks of those who use marijuana are more likely to be. Could you comment on that?
Oh, that particular association. Yes, I think that the point I was making is that drug use is a phenomenon that people engage in, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, marijuana. So there's a tendency for individuals who use one drug to use other drugs because they enjoy the effects of drugs and are presumably more needing of drug effects to help them deal with anxiety or depression, or they enjoy drug effects. So there was always an association between using one drug and using other drugs. The directionality is, you cannot prove the directionality. This doesn't prove that cannabis use leads to binge drinking. And certainly the UK situation, I don't believe would support this, but it is clear that people who use drugs, yes.
But there's no parity with your opinion that making cannabis available and legal would substitute alcohol. In other words, cannabis users would stop drinking alcohol, or people would stop drinking alcohol and rather choose cannabis as their preferred drug.
Well, that's a separate question, because we don't know whether these marijuana users would have drunk more alcohol if they hadn't used marijuana. I can just reiterate what I've said earlier, that a significant number of individuals would prefer to use marijuana where it's legal. We know that from questionnaires, etc. We also know from the example of cities where, like Amsterdam, where you have availability of both, and cities like Liverpool and Manchester and London where you only have alcohol. We know that the social pleasure of being in a city that allows access to marijuana as well as alcohol is considerably enhanced by the fact that there is much less violence, much less vomiting, much less social disorder. So I think you could almost certainly make the case that a mixed economy of marijuana and alcohol provides social benefits by reducing not only the consumption of alcohol, but also perhaps some of the more aggressive and unpleasant aspects of drinking.
Do you have any research literature to back that up?
I don't believe there have been studies on that, but as I say, those are observations that I have made and many others have made.
Your observations?
Yes.
Could I ask you to put away file 12 and take up file 13? if you can start at page 123, you'll recognize this article, the article by, I think it's Kim Wolf. This is one of the articles referenced in your slides, correct?
Correct.
You used this article, bear with me, to reference a tabulation of sorts at page 135 of this bundle. If you could go there. Just keep your finger at the beginning. So at 135 we see the axes there that you have provided, which demonstrated that the use of cannabis, the likelihood for vehicular crashes was set at twice, alcohol 8 times, and alcohol and cannabis 16 times. And this was the article you relied on. Would that be a correct summation of that slide?
So, well, let's just be clear what it's showing. This slide is showing likelihoods, odd ratios. So the odds ratio for cannabis, or having an accident when cannabis is detected, is just a bit less than 2. For alcohol, it's a bit more than 8. And for them together, it's just over 16. Correct.
Thank you. If you turn to page 125, approximately 9 lines from the bottom, on the left-hand side, the sentence starts, Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction 2010.
Yes.
You see that? And then I'm going to read from the next sentence. Other strains are reported to have increased potency. Northern Lights, such as, has a THC content of 15 to 20%. And Durban Poison is a South African strain reported to have THC concentrations of 8 to 15%. You, in your evidence, I think the day before yesterday, in other words on Tuesday, I recall you saying that, well, in South Africa, we don't have things such as skunk as one has in the UK.
I think the position in South Africa, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the majority of cannabis that is used is from the local native variety.
So, Professor, you're not an expert on our local cannabis, are you?
Could you tell me, please, what proportion of individuals in South Africa are using Durban poison?
Professor,
my understanding is it's localized to just a few areas, such as Durban. I don't believe that the vast majority of cannabis use in South Africa is of skunk. That is my understanding from talking to South African experts.
Professor, firstly, I'm not here to answer the questions, I'm here to ask them.
Then
Secondly, I'm not an expert. You're the one who purports to be the expert. If you're not an expert on the South African makeup of marijuana, then please don't make any submissions or proposals in that regard. My point was not, as you pretend it is in the last part. My point is just that you said we don't have problems such as skunk. And skunk in the United Kingdom, per what you described to us, is cannabis that has high concentrations of THC, higher than what one finds in the UK, whether it's however that is achieved. Not so. That's what skunk is.
Yes.
And we have Durban Poison, and 8 to 15% concentration is a very high concentration of THC, is it not?
That is true. Yes, that is skunk.
Thank you. If you go to page 127.
My Lord, if I could just make one observation, though. Would you allow that, please, in terms of this question of South African data? Would you mind?
We've moved past that, Professor, and we know that you're not an expert in this, so we need to move on.
The data you provided show, if you turn if you turn to page 24 of the bundle, there is the data on South African cannabis.
I don't know what
And-
you're, 24 of which bundle?
Your bundle here, the paper this is the paper you supplied me. Page
20
24 of your bundle shows there is no data in the WHO
sorry,
report
sorry, Professor.
on the harms on cannabis.
Sorry, Professor. 24 where?
In this bundle we're looking at, bundle
Yes,
30.
this bundle starts at 124.
This bundle,
Are you referring to 124?
I have page 24 here in this bundle.
Sorry.
Page 24 towards the beginning.
Mine starts at 123, my lord. Does yours start at 123?
Page 1.
Sorry, yours starts at page 1.
If my lord looks at page 24, you see there is no data on cannabis use in
One
South
moment,
Africa.
Before you continue, I just want to establish, have you found the
Yes, I just want to establish what the problem is, my lord.
dividing
Can you just
cover?
give me a
The
second?
dividing
That's
cover says page 1 to page 240.
1 to 240. Are you referring to the World Drug Report?
I am, yes.
Thank you. I understand. It's my fault. I just put it into another file to avoid the cumbersome nature of a full file. Well, Professor, I heard what you said. You said that this says there is no data on South African cannabis use. Is that
Not in this report. No.
very well? But that wasn't my point. My point was, as I've already made to you, that we have an equivalent of skunk. It's called Durban poison.
You do, and the question is, to what extent is it used? And that's
Well-
something I think you should ask South African experts.
Well, you make a very good point there. It's something that needs to be addressed before any decisions can be made. Not so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just bear with me, my lord.
Yes.
At page 127, approximately the fifth line down, it reads, that part of the line starts present in 58% of drug-positive samples. This next sentence reads, the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction found that between 0.3% and 7.4% of drivers tested positive for cannabis. You see that?
I do see that.
Page I just want to test the relevance. Page 129. At the bottom, the last paragraph, I'll read that. As with alcohol and other drugs, the influence of cannabis on drug driving behavior depends on the dose taken and the length of time between dosing and driving taking place. Unlike alcohol, however, regardless of the dose consumed, and owing to its high lipid solubility and large volume of distribution, THC is stored in tissues and organs throughout the body. You agree with that?
That is correct.
In fact, the time periods up to which one can still both find traces or find the markers of cannabis in the body, THC, as well as cognitive effects, is said to be as high as 28 days. You've read that too.
I do not believe that. There is considerable literature on how long the effect of cannabis on performance lasts, and it's generally agreed that the effect is usually over within about 12 hours. So a similar time course of effect. The problem with these data is that you can, because cannabis stays in the body for a long time, you can detect it in the urine or the blood at levels which are not impairing function for a very long time, as you say, around 28 days. But that doesn't mean it's impairing people up to 28 days. Most of the evidence suggests that the impairment lasts no more than about 12 hours.
Well, I'll just tell you now that I'll be taking you to evidence that suggests otherwise. In fact, cognitive impairment in what I expect to get to is some 21 days, but there are reports of up to 28 days.
Could I emphasize the point here that this paper is about the ability to drive, and my understanding from this paper is that they are suggesting that the effect is probably over. I think somewhere in here they do quote those figures, but so I think it's hard to conclude that cannabis has an effect that lasts more than about 12 hours on the ability to drive.
This is your article you relied on in any event.
It is.
So,
it is.
if we go to page 136, the second paragraph, the DRUID report. The DRUID report found in Europe, on average, between 20 and 30% of cannabis use was in combination with other psychoactive substances, and also noted that THC was most commonly detected when drugs were found in multi-drug combinations, alongside cocaine and benzodiazepines.
Yes, I read that.
And then if you go 3 lines down, there's a sentence, cannabis was the most, I'll read that, cannabis was the most prevalent drug in cases of simultaneous polydrug use, being used in 73% of the most recent incidents. You read that.
I do.
If you could turn over, any comment on that?
Well, cannabis is commonly used, so it's likely to be commonly detected.
And it's used in conjunction with other drugs, polydrugging or polypharmacy, I think it's also referred to.
Well, as I said earlier on, people who use drugs often use cannabis. They often use it to come down from cocaine or to take away the side effects of cocaine. But the majority of cannabis users do not use cocaine or other more harmful drugs.
And equally, many cannabis users use other drugs.
Well,
it goes both ways.
It can go both ways, but there are two populations, really. There are the population of people who just use cannabis, and there are a population of people who use drugs. And people who use drugs often use many drugs, including cannabis.
Are you suggesting cannabis is not a drug?
There are people who just use cannabis.
But are you suggesting cannabis is not a drug?
No, of course, cannabis is a drug. Of course.
Right, so I just wanted to clear up. You said only a few moments ago that there was no proof as to what the direction is. You seem to be suggesting there is a direction. Now.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying that there are different profiles of drug use. And there are some people who just use cannabis. There are some people who just use alcohol. Some people use both. In our own particular study, we see about half of all people who use half of all alcohol-dependent people use cannabis. And we see that if you look at heroin dependence or cocaine dependence, then a lot higher proportion use cannabis. But there are clearly people who just use cannabis.
We'll let the record and the proven statistics speak for themselves there. Professor, if we could go to page 139. One of the biggest subjects of discussion in this trial has been cannabis and schizophrenia. Now here is a research report by Matthew Hickman et al. It's titled Cannabis and Schizophrenia Model Projections of the Impact of the Rise in Cannabis Use on Historical and Future Trends in Schizophrenia in England and Wales, your part of the world. Won't you read the abstract to us, please, or into the record?
To estimate long-term trends in cannabis use and projections of schizophrenia, assuming a causal relation between cannabis use and schizophrenia. Methods. Trends in cannabis use were estimated from a national survey, 2003, and incidence of schizophrenia was derived from surveys in 3 English cities, 1997 to 1999. A difference equation cohort model was fitted against estimates of schizophrenia incidence, trends in cannabis exposure, and assumptions on associations between cannabis and schizophrenia. The model projects trends in schizophrenia incidence, prevalence, and attributable fraction of cannabis-induced schizophrenia. Results. Between 1970 and 2002, cannabis exposure increased by fourfold. Period prevalence tenfold, and use amongst under 18-year-olds 18-fold. In 1977 to 99, incidence of
97 to 99.
Yes.
Yes.
Prevalence of schizophrenia were 17 per 100,000, 0.63% among men, and 7.3 per 100,000, and 0.3% among women, respectively. If cannabis use causes schizophrenia, early increases in cannabis use would lead to increases in overall schizophrenia incidence and prevalence of 29% and 12% amongst men between 1990 and 2010. By 2010, model projections which assume an association between schizophrenia and light and heavy users suggest that approximately 1/4 of new schizophrenia cases could be due to cannabis, where if the association is twofold and confined to heavy cannabis users, then approximately 10% of cases may be due to cannabis. Conclusions. If cannabis use causes schizophrenia, and assuming other causes are unchanged, then relatively substantial increases in both prevalence and incidence of schizophrenia should be apparent by 2010. More accurate data on cannabis consumption and future monitoring of schizophrenia are critical.
Now, this was an article written in 2006. Professor, in the UK, or particularly here, it's England and Wales, is there a register or is there an incidence of reporting of schizophrenia?
There is. There are data which that I showed you on my slide, which comes from the Medical Research Council database. And I would just point out, my Lord, that the computations I gave you in my presentation were done by this man, Hickman. So my point I made about a proportional exposure leading to schizophrenia, Hickman was the author largely of the data in the second ACMD report. In their second report.
Now let's see what he says in all fairness to you, and so as to properly inform the court. Go to page 147 to conclusions.
The witness obviously wanted to refer to a slide.
Would you first refer to page 147 and then come back to the slide?
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Let me read that. I'll take this one, Professor. Our data provide no direct evidence on whether cannabis use causes schizophrenia. They appear to confirm assumptions of substantial increases in cannabis use in the UK population over the last 30 years and suggest a shift to more prolonged use initiated at younger ages. This shift is relatively recent, and its full impact on population levels of schizophrenia, if cannabis use does cause schizophrenia, may not yet be apparent. However, this impact should become apparent within the next 5 years. Consideration of these questions is constrained significantly by the lack of reliable data on trends in both cannabis use and schizophrenia, emphasizing the importance that these data be collected in future through robust surveillance systems. Now, that's the full context. I believed it was set out what Hickman is in fact saying.
Well, that is correct. And in fact, what he's saying is these data I showed you on page 5, that there is no change in cannabis, in schizophrenia or psychosis prevalence over
done more than 10 years ago, Professor, so your slide is somewhat unreliable. Do you have any more recent data you can refer us to?
I haven't redone this analysis since 2009. No.
Well, this
Relying on the latest data, because there's always a lag in terms of the time you can collate and synthesize data. So this was the data that was available at graphs are obtained. Certainly until 2006, there was no relationship between the increase in cannabis use and the incidence or prevalence of psychosis. I believe the fact that no one has provided data to show otherwise.
and if I tell you,
One moment. In the slide you refer to, which one? Thank you.
I hope to take you to, I think it is in that document that was handed up by yourself on behalf of the plaintiffs, or on behalf of the etc.
Yes.
Would it surprise you if I told you that they have recently categorically said there's a link between marijuana use and schizophrenia? Lord, I've asked the question, I've asked him if it would surprise him, and I've put the proposition to him. My Lord, he must simply answer it.
No, my lord. With respect, counsel are not entitled
Lord, my learned friend seeks to curtail my cross-examination. The witness, I'm dealing with a document that the witness was placed
Is
before
that
you.
document available, Mr. Willis?
It is, my Lord, except that it may not necessarily, Lord, I didn't say to him that that document says that. In fact, I qualified and I said it may not be in that document. Would it surprise because I found else has said categorically that there is a link. So I haven't referred him to the document.
That must be available.
No, my Lord,
I don't understand this.
my Lord, the veracity of my statement can be tested by your Lordship.
So the question is again, sorry?
The question is, would it surprise you? Does this surprise you? That publication have
Effects of cannabis and cannabinoids.
and what is the organization?
It's the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine.
That's right, Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine.
Correct.
Correct. Does it surprise you? There's a link between schizophrenia and cannabis use.
No, that would not surprise me, because there is clearly a relationship between having the symptoms of schizophrenia, or psychosis rather than schizophrenia, and using cannabis, because when people use cannabis, the effects are similar to being psychotic. And use of cannabis in people who are psychotic can certainly magnify their illness and potentially perpetuate the duration of illness. But it would surprise this if there is any relation acquisition of a psychotic illness. And in fact, reports actually an increased incidence of psychosis or certainly of schizophrenia. That is still uncertain.
We'll come back to that.
I take it, Mr. Wallace, you will.
Yes, I'll come back to that. Well, do you?
I do.
It is written together with Marta Di Forti. You know him too.
It's a her, yes.
Is it a her? I thought it was a her, but somebody indicated it was wrong, but thank you.
No, at the time, she was his research assistant.
I see.
Is this the same Professor Murray you referred to yesterday?
Yes, it is. Now, leaving aside Professor Murray's views and conclusions in this article, you do accept that he is an accomplished and respected expert in the very field that you operate in, psychiatric medicine?
Britain's leading.
Researcher and writer on the literature, and in fact he was knighted on account of his work in medical science.
He was, yes.
Now,
psychosis. I think this is quite a critical issue here, and I had the pleasure of interviewing both of them just a few weeks ago at a conference. The schizophrenia is a relatively rare disorder. Psychosis is more common. Most of their research is around psychosis, so it is dangerous to infer that a change in levels of psychosis mean that there's an increase in the levels of schizophrenia. So I have to say, I mean, she is a researcher. I wouldn't say she is as accomplished as Murray, and I do have significant misgivings and criticisms, which I shared with her just a few weeks ago, about the nature of her conclusions, which I think could be explained by factors other than cannabis use.
there's no doubt in your mind then about any link or causality between cannabis use and psychosis?
Well, cannabis use makes people psychotic. We've established that.
Thank you.
That's what cannabis does to anyone who uses it. Anyone who is stoned and is interviewed by a psychiatrist will register a significant number of symptoms which are compatible with being psychotic. That doesn't mean that they have an enduring psychotic illness. And this is the confound, that it is difficult to separate the effects of using the drug from the underlying propensity to a disorder or the disorder itself.
But once one is established that there's addiction, then you have cannabis use disorder.
You do, and
You mean one does? I don't.
one does. One does.
You mean to say you agree with me? Is that right, Professor? You're agreeing with my
Yeah,
statement?
I'm agreeing with you.
Thank you.
I'm agreeing with you. Yes, if you're dependent on cannabis, you have cannabis use disorder.
I was just worried about that evidence.
Before you continue, sorry to interrupt you. I just want to understand something you said earlier that I got it correctly, that cannabis use makes people psychotic. But
Yes.
earlier, and that earlier you said, and this is where I want you to correct me if I misunderstood you, but it's not been proven that psychosis causes schizophrenia. Is that what you said?
No. So maybe it'll be if you looked at slide 15, I could explain it to you a bit more easily. So the lower lines are schizophrenia. The higher lines are psychosis. Psychosis covers other disorders of the mind. It can include people with bipolar disorder. It will also include people who have drug-induced psychosis. But, and when a doctor has to make a diagnosis of psychosis, they will ask a series of questions. Do you think people are talking about you?
No, I don't think.
Sorry.
All I wanted to do is what you said earlier. Did I get it, understand it correctly? That psychosis, there's no proof that psychosis itself causes schizophrenia. I just want to understand it.
Oh, that, no, I didn't. Yes, psychosis occurs within schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a form of psychosis, but there are other forms of psychosis. So no, psychosis does not cause schizophrenia.
Thank you.
If you could now read the abstract into the record, please, Professor.
Cannabis has been known for at least 4,000 years to have profound effects on the mind, effects that have provoked dramatically divergent attitudes towards it. Some societies have regarded cannabis as a sacred boon for mankind that offers respite from the tribulations of everyday life, whereas others have demonized it as inevitably leading to reefer madness. The debate between the protagonists and prohibitionists has recently been reignited. But unfortunately, this debate continues mainly in ignorance of our new understandings of the effects of cannabis on the brain and of studies that have quantified the extent of the risks of long-term use.
Is that a fair introduction? You don't disagree with it? It was a good synopsis in 2007 of where the debate was?
Well, I don't think the debate continues in ignorance.
Not anymore.
It does continue. Yes.
Not anymore.
No.
So we agree on that. The debate doesn't continue in ignorance anymore.
Yes.
If you in the left-hand column, the second paragraph starts with the word recently. Won't you read that paragraph to the end of the page? Well, just the end of that column, please.
Recently, however, cannabis has re-emerged as both a potential medicine and a potentially harmful drug. On the one hand, cannabis-based drugs have been shown to be of value to people with chronic pain and to control spasticity in patients with multiple sclerosis. On the other hand, a number of reports have claimed that heavy use of cannabis increases the risk of psychotic illnesses such as schizophrenia. If the latter is true, even for a small minority of cannabis users, this will be of considerable public health importance because cannabis is the world's third most popular recreational drug after alcohol and tobacco.
Now, that's not an irrational position to take as a medical scientist, is it?
Causing schizophrenia as
No, the position he takes is at the end. He says that if the latter is true, for even a small minority of cannabis users, this would be of considerable public health importance because cannabis is the world's third most popular recreational drug. So
well,
that's not an irrational position to take as a medical scientist, is it?
It would all depend on whether it's true and the magnitude of the impact that cannabis has on to produce schizophrenia compared with the other health benefits. It would be, I mean, as we have said many times, it's not a question of simply identifying harms. It's a question of looking at the global profile of benefits and harms and also comparing them with the harms of even more popular drugs like alcohol and tobacco.
So Professor Murray is certainly someone in your society back home who influences policy too, does he not? And outcomes. He's a prolific writer of literature. He's well known in your realm of psychiatric medicine.
Yes.
And he also was somebody who was in the press and reported on at the time that you were sacked in late 2009. He was one of the, you would call him one of the prohibitionists.
He was one of the few people that did not oppose my sacking, I think it would be fair to say.
Well, he didn't oppose your sacking, no. I think by what you're saying by that is he welcomed it.
I didn't think he went that far.
No, but probably not. I'm just a bit of banter with you there. But the point is that he was vocal in the media, and he was quoted in the press. The point is that you have lumped scientists together with politicians, together with prohibitionists, and criticized them somewhat severely in the course of your evidence.
Yes.
Is it really fair to lump the likes of Professor Murray in that criticism that you've at times, with respect, ranted about?
Oh, I don't think I ever rant, but I may be forceful. Let me just share a few observations on this topic. The first thing I would say, and you may have come across this in your readings of Murray's writings, is that Murray has consistently said that the classification of the drug is of relatively limited consequence. However, I believe that our government has taken his writings, particularly in relation to psychosis, as being evidence that prohibition works. And in fact, it was one of the platforms which the government used to argue for a more stringent control of cannabis, moving it from Class C, the least penalized class, to Class B. I sadly believe now that that increased penalization of cannabis users has directly contributed to magnifying the problem that we have with cannabis and mental health in Britain. Murray's position has actually led to the development of skunk and to the introduction of synthetic cannabinoids, which are much worse, as he shows you in this paper and other papers, for the mental health of our people. So paradoxically, the concerns he's raised about cannabis and schizophrenia have led to a self-perpetuating worsening of the situation in the UK. He has contributed to the growth of psychotic, or the use of more psychotomimetic forms of cannabis and synthetic cannabinoids by virtue of him having a less than balanced view on the benefits of prohibition.
How does a scientist take a balanced view when a scientist is meant to report on and interpret the statistics and the scientific research? What is that concept of a balanced view? He's not a policy maker. He's not an advocate for prohibition.
Well,
he's a scientist who draws from his research certain conclusions and pins his colours to the mast in that way, Professor.
Well, indeed, and I think the problem is, the problem is that Robin has, it might be worth looking at his career. So Robin Murray is a specialist researcher in schizophrenia. He has made most of his career looking at schizophrenia. He did used to work, actually one of my inspirations for starting to work in alcohol was because he did some interesting observational studies in alcoholism many years ago and started arguing that the drinks industry should be contributing to the healthcare costs of the harms of alcohol. And that, when I was a junior doctor, that was an inspiration to me. But for the last 30 years, he has focused on trying to understand the causation of this perplexing disorder of schizophrenia. And Robin has conducted research that has led to hypotheses about schizophrenia. They include influenza infection in mothers when they're pregnant. They include immigration, particularly from the Caribbean and Jamaica. They include living in inner cities. And now they include cannabis. And it is laudable that he has attempted to find causations, but up till now, none of them have been proven, and none of them have led to any effective interventions. And the problem is that politicians have clung on to this concern he has raised about schizophrenia which might be true, might not be true, but even if it is true, it is not a justification for criminalizing the use of cannabis, because it makes the problem worse. Now, as you will see, and you'll probably take me to other papers of theirs in this file, you will see that where he works, there is only skunk. And the people with psychosis and schizophrenia in Camberwell, where he works, if they use cannabis at all they can get is skunk. So he has contributed to the political debate about prohibition in a way which is actually worse than the outcome for the patients he cares about.
The difference between him and you, though, Professor, is that he's a scientist. You're an advocate for the legalization of marijuana.
Well, I am obviously a scientist as well. I think.
Yes, as well. I'm not leaving. I don't intend just to leave it out. But the difference is.
I think you could argue that his failing to comprehend the very negative impact of prohibition on his patients is, to some extent, a dereliction of his clinical duties, at the very least.
That's your opinion?
That's my opinion.
Of course, I have no doubt his retort would be that yours is a dereliction of your ethical duties, if you consider his position, as I read from the first column in his article.
No, the column here, we are debating about the comparative harms of the drug versus the benefits. And we've already established there may be people who, for instance, with post-traumatic stress disorder, who get significant benefit from cannabis. The issue we need to think about is why do patients with schizophrenia use cannabis? And the evidence is that it helps them. Most of them are not dependent. They use it for a number of reasons, but in many cases they use it because it helps them deal with their lives. And they're filling a gap that the medical profession is not properly addressing. That is the key issue about cannabis and schizophrenia, not whether it causes it or not, but why people continue to use it, even if they're not dependent. And that's where we should be focusing our research.
Page 171, please, Professor. This is an article, again, Professor Murray contributes to this together with Morrison et al., the acute effects of synthetic intravenous tetrahydrocannabinol on psychosis, mood, and cognitive functioning. I'm just going to read the conclusion. What they find is they confirm that THC can induce a transient acute psychotic reaction in psychiatrically well individuals. The extent of the psychotic reaction was not related to the degree of anxiety or cognitive impairment. So this is research done on healthy persons without any indication of psychosis, and they find that it induces psychotic outcome.
Yes, I mean, there is a literature going back way before this, particularly from the group at Yale University in the USA. Cannabis is a useful model for psychosis. It's a way of producing in people who haven't got psychosis something that you can reliably elicit and then try to study. So people use cannabis to model psychosis, to find brain sites of psychosis, and also to find new treatments of psychosis. So yeah, absolutely. Like a number of drugs, like psilocybin, or DMT, or ketamine. These are research compounds that help people understand the brain processes that underlie psychosis.
If you could turn to page 181. Are you aware of the Delgado Drug and Alcohol Research Team, DART?
Not closely, no.
Well, very well. This is written by a child safety advocate, one Josephine Baxter. She writes, "The rights of the child, ensuring a child-centered drug policy is a vital human rights issue for those who influence drug policy." Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't say that, ensuring a child-centered drug. The policy should be across the board.
In this jurisdiction, the interests of the child, as I told you yesterday, are paramount. So
Well,
I'd have to point out to you they would be child-centered in this country.
okay.
It's just so that we can move quickly through this. She speaks to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Are you aware of the Convention of the Rights of the Child?
Only generally.
Generally. Do I take from that that you have, in much of your thinking, you have then not fully considered the rights of the child?
No, we have always considered the health of the child, which I suppose is what's relevant here, and it was a major issue when we were, it's one of the key issues when we were looking at the methodology for comparing regulatory regimes. It was a specific element in that discourse. It's a specific score in our matrix, because we appreciate that children are vulnerable and children need protection. And so it's a central question that always has to be addressed when we are looking at the effects of drugs.
The United Kingdom, just like South Africa, is a member state of the United Nations Conventions on the Right of the Child. You know
Yes.
that. If you can turn to page 183, conveniently set out there Article 33, which reads that they, states such as the United Kingdom and South Africa, shall take all appropriate measures, including legislative, administrative, social and educational measures, to protect children from the illicit use of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances as defined in the relevant international treaties, and to prevent the use of children in the illicit production and trafficking of such substances. Article 3 reads, in all actions concerning children, whatever undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration. Article 6 reads, every child has the inherent right to life, and that member states shall ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and development of the child. Article 27 states that member states recognize the right of every child to a standard of living adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development. Have you taken all of that into account in your views
I believe we have,
and
yes.
opinions expressed?
I believe so. My approach over the last 30 years has always been to try to minimize the potential harms to underage or children. Yes.
If you can go over to page 184. The following point is made that the saddest reality of all is that there is a correlation between child abuse and drug abuse, with a multiplier effect which is now intergenerational. This has huge ramifications for drug policy makers and our emerging generation. Professor, you've had a lot to say in the course of your evidence about why you believe that there should be the legalization of drugs, all drugs, and you've expressed various comments in and about your own ideas of how it should be. If you could please...
Shall I just, qualify?
At the end, please.
Wait until Mr. Willis completes his question.
And your views on drug regulation. But I haven't heard you say, in answer to recent questions of mine, reflect on the interests of children and families for that matter, which you concede are affected.
Indeed.
What is your comment on that statement?
Well, the first comment
Firstly,
is,
what is your clarification you seek?
it is wrong to represent my opinion as that I'm in favor of the legalization of all drugs. That is not true.
Professor, can I stop you there? Your own expert summary speaks of the full legalization of cannabis in that context.
I thought you said all drugs.
I did say all drugs because that is nonetheless how we understand your evidence.
Well, that is not true.
Well, then you better correct that now.
I do not believe in I have made that very clear over many years. What I believe, and this is based on evidence from countries which have taken an approach particularly the Portuguese example, I believe that decriminalisation of the personal possession of all drugs is the most appropriate approach to minimise damage to drug users and their families. And the reason I say that is that the worst thing you can do to a family is to prosecute a parent for possessing a drug and take them away from the family and put them in prison, possibly for the rest of their lives, or even in some countries execute them. That is much more destructive to the family than the likelihood of the impact of the drug use in the parent. So it is precisely to protect families that I am in favour of decriminalising personal possession of all drugs. This Portuguese experiment shows that that has been an effective way of reducing crime, reducing costs, and reducing the burden of drugs to society. So I'm on record to say that, and I believe that overall that approach will be of the greatest benefit to families and children.
Would the best, is not the worst thing you can do to a child is to expose that child to drugs and cannabis?
No, the worst thing you can do, I believe, to a child is to deprive it of its parents, so that it has to live on the streets and fend for itself by either using drugs or selling drugs.
So you're not in favor of the ideal of eradicating drug taking, cannabis use? Is that not your first port of call?
Of course not. I mean, that would be, no, I mean,
Of course not.
for two reasons. I mean, eradicating, well, even if we could, I'm not sure it would be right. And what I can say categorically is that the attempts to eradicate the use of drugs have led to the greater use of drugs. I have repeatedly said this, certainly in my country, and please don't you go down the same route. Trying to eradicate cannabis use has led to the rise of skunk, and now it has led to the rise of synthetics. And these are much more destructive, and they are killing people. Cannabis does not kill people. We had 60 deaths from synthetic cannabinoids last year, just in an attempt by people to get around the control of cannabis. It is the attempt to eliminate drug use through prohibition and the criminal justice system is a destructive and pointless exercise. And there are many more appropriate approaches that we can use to protect children of parents who do use drugs.
Professor, page 189, please. Staying with the theme of children, this is a report out of Germany, High Achievers, Cannabis Access and Academic Performance, Marie et al. If you go to turn over the page to page 190, won't you please read the abstract into the record?
This paper investigates how legal cannabis access affects student performance. Identification comes from an exceptional policy introduced in the city of Maastricht, which discriminated legal access based on individuals' nationality. We apply a difference in difference approach using an administrative panel data on over 54,000 course grades of local students enrolled at Maastricht University before and during the partial cannabis prohibition. We find that academic performance of students who are, I guess were, no longer legally permitted to buy cannabis increases substantially. Grade improvements are driven by younger students and the effects are stronger for women and low performers. In line with how THC consumption affects cognitive functioning, we find that the performance gains are larger for courses that require more numerical mathematical skills. We investigate the underlying channels using students' course evaluations and present suggestive evidence that performance gains are driven by improved understanding of material rather than changes in student study efforts.
If you can go to page 202, I'll read this for you. It's the conclusion. In this paper, we have investigated how restricting cannabis access affects student achievements. we find that the performance of students who lose legal access to cannabis improves substantially. Our analysis of underlying channels suggests that the effects are specifically driven by an improvement in numerical skills, which existing literature has found to be particularly impaired by cannabis consumption. This provides perhaps the first clear causal evidence of an important positive effect on short-term productivity of restricting legal access to cannabis. Our findings also imply that individuals do change their consumption behavior when the legal status of drug changes. Any comment on that?
Well, yes, a couple. And I have to say, I'm not entirely sure if this paper's been peer-reviewed. And I did struggle to understand the table on page 205, the figure which seemed actually, it seemed to show the opposite of what they were saying, but maybe it's just to do with the way in which they did the analyses. But so whether it's real, whether the data stand up to proper statistical scrutiny, I don't know. But let's assume it is correct. I would say two things. Well, the first thing is they point out in this paper that the effects limited to mathematical skills are similar to those of alcohol, whereas alcohol has an effect across all skills. And the second thing I would say is that it was a really clever experiment to do, because they took an opportunity where the town of Maastricht decided to change its cannabis cafe policy and limit it to essentially locals. What happened in Maastricht, and the reason this experiment was terminated, was because within days of cannabis being denied to non-locals, Moroccan gangs were coming into Maastricht and selling cannabis and harder drugs on the street. And that is why this experiment was terminated, because it led to greater problems. So there may have been an impact on the students, but the social impact was of such concern that the policy was reversed. And that's an example of how prohibition drives the use of more dangerous substances and encourages, for the first time really in Holland, a black market of cannabis.
Page 215. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, 211.
Yes.
High potency cannabis and the risk of psychosis. Another article by DeForty and with Murray contributing, DeForty et al. With Murray contributing.
Yes.
I'll read the background. People who use cannabis have an increased risk of psychosis, an effect attributed to the active ingredient, that's the A9-THC. There has recently been concern over an increase in the concentration in the cannabis available in many countries. Their method here was, we collected information on cannabis use from 280 cases, presenting with a first episode of psychosis to the South London and Maudsley National Health Service Foundation. So that's first episode, the first time they have a negative effect from a cannabis.
Yes.
Their conclusions, the finding that people with a first episode of psychosis had smoked higher potency cannabis for longer and with greater frequency than a healthy control group is consistent with the hypothesis that THC is the active ingredient, increasing risk of psychosis. This has important public health implications given the increased availability and use of high potency cannabis. I think you agree with all of that. Am I correct?
Yes, I believe that this was the paper where they actually said they did not believe that hash contributed to psychosis. Let me just have a look. I think it's here that they...
Well, it's not the subject matter of it.
Yes, I think that they... I'm pretty certain. This is the paper which, for the first time, said it was only the high potency cannabis that led to psychosis.
You need to find that if you believe that.
Yes, let me have a look.
On my reading, it wasn't the subject matter of this article, Professor.
No, but I think, let's have a look. Yes, if you look at table top of 213, you'll see type used. So they've separated resin in the bottom box, resin from sinsemilla. And you can see, if you come across to the odds ratio, you see the odds ratio of using resin is 1, which means there is no effect. So this, I believe, proves that the use of traditional cannabis, balanced cannabis, is not associated with psychosis. So this is an important paper for that reason, as well as the fact that strong skunk is.
Psychosis or schizophrenia?
Well, I think you will find that this paper is about psychosis. And we approached all patients who presented with the first episode of psychosis. Do they actually break it down, whether it's schizophrenia?
I think you have the wrong article, Professor.
I do not believe they... I think what you need to know, I think this article is very careful. It does not talk about schizophrenia.
No, it doesn't. It's not the subject.
They do not talk about schizophrenia because I believe they know. Look, they do know, and let's not pretend this. We had this there was a conference on this 2 weeks ago in England with various experts looking at the relationship.
Professor, the article doesn't speak to schizophrenia.
And
that's the point.
Cannabis does not cause schizophrenia.
It's not the subject matter of the article. Could you go to page 228, please?
Okay. The subject matter is psychosis. I'm just explaining why it doesn't talk to schizophrenia, because...
And you distinguish psychosis as a form of schizophrenia as a form of psychosis, one that must be distinguished yourself, you said earlier. And that doesn't speak to it. That's just my point. Nothing more, nothing less. I think you have the wrong article in mind.
This, well, okay.
And that,
all right,
I understand that.
Let me reframe what I've just said. This paper shows that if you smoke traditional cannabis, hash, you have no greater likelihood of going to hospital with psychosis than if you didn't. So I think this is important.
Professor Page, my lord, there has been a request from the plaintiff. Well, maybe I should pose the following. Would you like to take the tea adjournment now if his lordship is inclined to allow it, Professor? Would that be opportune for you?
Fine by me, yes.
My lord, if your lordship's only on the basis that we've been going since 9:30 and it's now almost 11 o'clock, it's the professor obviously who's in the box and whose interests I'm considering.
We'll take the normal 15-minute. We reconvene at 11:15 then.
As your lordship pleases.
One moment. Just one moment. Court adjourns.
crazy about digging up pavements and streets and everything. And the other night I went to the second bay. It just looks so terrible. Covering anything, then it starts bleeding again.
Oh, yes.
He
Dependence
doesn't
producing
even know what he's saying. He's such a moron.
But you're doing well.
Thank you. I've just got to find a document that they put into their bundle. Listen, I just sat down before we walked out.
No.
The reason I started was I suppose that's why. Just I don't understand whose paper is that? Sorry, I just have to jump into this here.
Oh, okay. No, this is the latest. This is the latest information on
Who's that from?
the new evidence.
Who wrote that out?
I want to go to the bottom one.
Who wrote this out?
I don't know. This guy from
page we're on now is 228, Professor. This is a pharmacology and toxicology paper. The grass isn't always greener, the effects of cannabis on embryological development. Would you read it in the abstract into the record, please?
With the increasing publicity of marijuana due to recent legislation, it is pertinent that the effects of fetal exposure to the drug are assessed. While in utero cannabis exposure has been associated with early pregnancy failure, birth defects, and developmental delay, the mechanisms of such outcomes are largely unexplained. Furthermore, the use of cannabinoids in cancer treatment via growth inhibition and apoptosis may indicate how cannabis exposure likely harms a growing fetus. Cannabinoid signaling is required for proper pre-implantation development, embryo transport to the uterus, and uterine receptivity during implantation. In post-implantation development, cannabinoid signaling functions in a multitude of pathways, including, but not limited to, folic acid, VEGF, PCNA, MAPK, and ERK, and BDNF. Disrupting the normal activity of these pathways can significantly alter many vital in utero processes, including angiogenesis, that's the growth of blood vessels, cellular replication, tissue differentiation, and neural cognitive development. This paper aims to demonstrate the effects of cannabis exposure on a developing embryo in order to provide a molecular explanation for the adverse outcomes associated with cannabis during pregnancy.
If we turn to 239, I'll read the conclusion. Under normal physiologic conditions, cannabinoid signaling exhibits a wide range of downstream effects embryologically, as illustrated in Figure 1. This breadth of action ultimately manifests in the symptoms associated with cannabis use during pregnancy, including miscarriage, congenital malformations, and learning disabilities. Cannabinoids have received renewed attention in the field of cancer treatment due to their pharmacologic activities in vivo as cell growth inhibitors, restrictors of cellular motility, and their ability to induce apoptosis across multiple cell lineages. However, by the same mechanisms that cannabinoids show promise in the field of cancer treatment, they prove equally dangerous to the viability and health of a developing embryo. A summary of these mechanisms is provided in Table 1. The effects of cannabinoids on pre-implantation and embryologic development have the potential to elicit harmful outcomes postnatally. While the method of consumption can affect the severity of the embryologic effects, it is important to note that this paper is an overview of the effects solely of elevated cannabinoid signaling. A common means of cannabis consumption is smoking, which can add a number of toxins and thereby amplify harmful effects to the embryo. Given the trend of marijuana decriminalization and legalization across the United States, further epidemiological research should focus on the association between maternal cannabinoid use and observation postnatal outcome. Professor, I know that this is not necessarily your area of expertise, but you did pass comment in the course of evidence, and I've pointed you to this article. Any further comment?
Well, I think the points it makes are very fair. It would certainly not be prudent for pregnant women to use cannabis the same way as we would prefer they didn't use alcohol or tobacco, both of which can cause serious harms to the fetus. And so this article essentially warns us that there's a possibility of any problems emerging, and we should do our very best to minimize those.
You just bear with me. Sorry, my lord, if you could just bear with me a moment. If I could ask you to turn to page 477. This is a drug use. This records drug use among youth national survey data report, a common liability of all drug use. It's once again an American-produced document. I'll just read the part of the introduction. Data source: the 2014 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, and various items or organizations. It requires that any description of overall sample sizes based on the restricted use data files has to be rounded to the nearest 100 to minimize potential disclosure risk. And then various other details that they would take into account. You'll also know that Drust was involved in preparation of this document. It starts off with various references which go for the first number of pages, but if you turn to page 484, the illustrative graphs commence there. I think we'll take them graph by graph, and I'll give you an opportunity to comment. As I understand the graph at page 484, Professor, this deals with the prevalence in the month and then lifetime substance use amongst youth aged 12 to 17. So as I understand the process, they would have taken their data from various sources and they would have aggregated it so that they can depict past month use and then lifetime use. What the first slide then shows is that in the past month use, the scale of probably around 7.5% of persons were using marijuana, while at the same time around 5% cigarette, closer to 12.5% alcohol, and then other illicit drugs. So all of those are consumed as use in youth aged 12 to 17. And then across the page one sees the lifetime use, which is significantly higher. Your comment on this?
Well, this shows that a significant proportion of young people use drugs even though they're all illegal for them at that age in the USA.
Yes, between 12 and 17, you're quite right, they're all illegal. If we go over the page to 485, this is past month use of alcohol, tobacco and illicit drugs among youth aged 12 to 17 by marijuana status. So you can see those who don't use marijuana, how they use the various substances, and then those who do use marijuana and significantly higher consumption across the board, except maybe for heavy alcohol. You see that. Any comment?
Yes, I think it reflects the point I made earlier that people who use drugs use other drugs, a variety of drugs, and the same is true with young people.
When one considers that marijuana is the third largest used, these graphs have significance. In the United States, we would say.
I'll put it on record, I am not in favour of young people using any drug. I can make that very clear.
Then we go to, on page 486, to figure 3. This is the past month use of tobacco, marijuana and illicit drugs amongst youth 12 to 17, but this time by the level of alcohol use. So in the first column we see non-alcohol users, and there's still an instance of them smoking cigarettes, smoking marijuana, and taking other illicit drugs, even though they're non-alcohol users.
Yes.
Then we move to alcohol use. This is just normal use. And one sees once again a significant increase across the board. Binge alcohol, a significant increase, and then heavy alcohol. But in each instance, the marijuana use just scales up drastically. So this bears out the preference of marijuana as a drug other than alcohol and cigarettes. And this is amongst the youth, of course.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think you'd have to provide ratios of each of the columns. I don't think you could say that marijuana was particularly more used in heavy alcohol users than illicit drugs, not marijuana. I mean, you'd have to have the figures, and the important measure is the ratio of marijuana in those groups to non-alcohol users, I guess.
Yes. Well, Professor McDrust, when she gives evidence, can be cross-examined on that sort of. On page 487, this is past month use of alcohol, marijuana, and illicit drugs amongst the youth by level of cigarette use. But one sees a similar pattern once again. So those who don't smoke cigarettes, they may use other substances, but those who do smoke cigarettes have a significantly higher usage of all the other. Save of again here we note that heavy alcohol usage is in the lower segment. Any further comment?
Well, I think the ratios seem similar, though, don't they? The ratio. The people who don't smoke cigarettes use about twice as much marijuana as other drugs, other illicit drugs, and the ones who do smoke cigarettes use a bit less than twice as much marijuana as other illicit drugs. The pattern's the same. And certainly not using cigarettes is a good predictor of not using other drugs.
Figure 5 on page 488. Last year, use of heroin among different age groups by level of marijuana use. So as I understand it, these columns all indicate heroin use, whether they're blue or red. The blue indicates a non-usage of marijuana, and the red indicates someone who does use marijuana. But in every instance, people who smoke marijuana or use marijuana, significant amounts of heroin too.
Can I just check? I don't have a coloured graph, but are the left-hand columns in each of the 4 blocks? So those are no marijuana.
The left-hand columns are no marijuana, and the right-hand columns are yes marijuana.
Okay.
So that's.
So clearly, 12 to 17, you're looking at the left pair of columns. Clearly, there's more heroin use in that group, and there's more heroin. Well, there's more heroin use in all the groups. Yes.
Yes. Shortly, I want to move on. But before I do that, I just want to dispose of that reference to the National Academy of Science and Engineering. I see that you have the book with you. If you go to page 205.
What is the title of the book?
The health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids.
My Lord, the document...
295, did you say?
Yes, in the book it's 295. My Lord, for the record, the part that I'm referring to is not to be found in the papers for your Lordship, but it was placed at the back of Professor Nutt's evidence yesterday at page 263. John? So that at page 263 one sees the, yes, that looks like a bundle. So that's the online printed version, I gather, to the professor for him. You do not have the page that we're going to allude to, though, my Lord, or to read from. The conclusion, Professor, at the bottom of page 2.295 reads, there is substantial evidence of a statistical association between cannabis use and the development of schizophrenia or other psychoses, with the highest risk among the most frequent users, of course. That is what I referred you to.
Yes.
Yes. So your position or your evidence, as I understood it, to say no link, there's no evidence. But they categorically say here that there is evidence. And they talk of a statistical association between cannabis and the development of schizophrenia.
So, if I may deconstruct that statement, there is substantial evidence of a statistical association Now that does not mean causation. As I have said several times, there is evidence available that suggests that genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia also occurs genetic vulnerability to using cannabis. So this may be an association but not a causation. That's the first point. The second point is, if I draw attention to the paragraph above the conclusion, they say halfway through that paragraph, in addition, it is noteworthy to state that in certain societies, the incidence of schizophrenia has remained stable over the past 50 years, despite the introduction of cannabis into those settings. Kirkbride et al., 2012. And what's interesting about the Kirkbride et al. Paper is that it's authored by the leading schizophrenia researchers in Britain, including Robin Murray. And then the third point I would make is if the most powerful would be taking a group of people who you know are very likely to develop schizophrenia. These are the so-called high-risk group who have already demonstrated some symptoms of psychosis. And if you turn to page 293, you'll see here that the most recent study, the 2015 Author study, the North American Prodrome longitudinal study, shows that if you take into account all the potential confounders, there is not a significant risk between, or not a significant association between cannabis abuse or dependence and the generation of psychosis in a group that is very vulnerable, the most vulnerable group to developing psychosis. So there's at least conflicting evidence, and I have to say I am surprised that this conclusion is as strong as it is, because it overstates the case that they have in the pages before them.
Well, I'm glad you said that they overstated, and I did not. But the point is, this is their conclusion, Professor.
This is their conclusion, and it is, I believe, in the data in the top paragraph of 293, and it comes up with an adjusted odds ratio of 1.41. So that suggests that you have 1.4 times the rate of developing psychosis if you use cannabis and than if you don't. Now, I just want, my Lordship, just to make you clear of what that means in the real world. If we were looking at the relationship between tobacco smoking and lung cancer, that ratio is 20. You're 20 times more likely to get lung cancer from smoking tobacco than if you don't smoke. Now, that is a strong relationship. An odds ratio of 1.4 means that it is quite a weak relationship. It may be true, and even if it's not causative, it may be important. It is a strong relationship.
Professor, as I understand the difficulty around the evidence pertaining to schizophrenia and its connection, association, causality nexus with cannabis, is that there is a paucity of data. In other words, this is not, as we saw with the graphs a few moments ago, there's a lot of information tracking 12 to 17-year-old students, but there's not a lot of information. There's a poor information schizophrenia and schizophrenia cannabis use. Is that correct?
Well, the reality is that this question has been addressed for 120 years, back to the in the 1890s. So people have looked very hard to find this association because it seems intuitive that it is there, and it makes sense of people's desire to regulate cannabis or to ban cannabis. If you look at the modern day data, I think you'll find, well, there's quite a bit of data here, but I concede the point that what we're lacking is data, and points it itself. We have data on what people are using, how much they're using, but so we cannot confidently say at present that cannabis use, as I said, causes schizophrenia, but it's not a good thing in people who do have a tendency to psychosis or who have psychosis. And I would concede that. I'm not arguing it isn't relevant. I'm just saying it's not causative. And the relevance is important in terms of addressing interventions, but I will emphasize again that prohibition is the least effective and maybe the most damaging intervention in terms of people who have a propensity to develop psychosis, because criminalizing them puts them into a whole nother environment where they're likely to be exposed to much more dangerous drugs and harmful.
So people with a propensity or some other indication of psychosis and propensity to schizophrenia, you agree should not be dabbling in the smoking of cannabis?
Well, I would advise people who have any propensity to to a psychotic illness not to use cannabis. Yes.
One of the part of the subject matter in the Academy of Science and Engineering, and they draw a conclusion too, is the treatment of these conditions with this. There was some, I think they conclude that there's no value in the treatment using cannabinoid or cannabis. You agree with that too?
Well, this is actually this is an area where Robin Murray and I agree that actually, and we disagree with this. So Professor Murray and I have written to the British government recently pointing out that the controls that we have that ban particularly the component THCV is significantly impairing his research to try to find out whether within the cannabis plant there are compounds which might treat schizophrenia. In fact, at this conference I mentioned I was at 2 weeks ago, there was data presented from the German group in Mannheim that the cannabis products may be useful in the treatment of schizophrenia, but those studies are very limited because the drugs are illegal.
You and, just to make the point, well, clearly, you and Professor Murray are also at odds on the source of your information. He's criticized you for relying on information garnered from general practitioners. No. You criticize him being based in the south of London and using data where there's a lot of skunk. Am I correct?
Yeah, this is a very important point. Very important, yes. And it is very clear from the latest data, and as I said, the 40 presented at a conference on this in England. And there are clearly peculiar anomalies in these data. So for instance...
Her data.
In her data.
Her
yes.
data.
If they look, taking a country like the Netherlands, where we have, quite a lot of high-quality psychiatrists, we also have access, or the people have access to decriminalize cannabis. You look at two cities. You look at Leiden, and you look at Amsterdam. They're 40 kilometers apart. And her data show enormous differences in the incidence of psychosis in those two cities. Now, those cities are comprised of the same people, largely. I mean, they're presumably Dutch people in both Amsterdam and Leiden. So you can't explain it unless there's another population there or something different is happening. And the cannabis that is sold in Leiden is the same as the cannabis that is sold in Amsterdam. So there must be some other factor. And those but it isn't simply going to be that.
I just mentioned to you, Science Daily reported on two recent studies as recent as April, August. There's an article by the University of Bristol. I don't have all the details. I just want to test with cannabis schizophrenia, new evidence. Are you aware of that?
Who's the first author, please?
It's just University of Bristol. It's just information.
I imagine the Munafo paper. I imagine that's that Marcus Munafo paper, which was also presented at this conference 2 weeks ago in Britain. And that is where I am taking my evidence that you... detail. I've asked the question, do people who have schizophrenia, do they have a genetic predisposition to using cannabis, and vice versa, do the people between the use of cannabis than cannabis causing schizophrenia. So I am aware of that, and that is why we cannot say categorically I think we can leave it there. And even if it did, prohibition is not the right, that's the point. Well, I think we're arguing in a very technical area here, which has really very little relevance to public health.
But the point is that the National Academy of Science and Engineering do state categorically that there is a link. A document you put before us yesterday. Now,
but they do not say it's causative. They say there is a statistical association. And I believe they use those words cautiously, because I do not believe they want to be put on the spot, like you're putting me on the spot, because I don't think they could defend themselves.
Of course, what one regards as, what criteria one uses will differ from scientist to scientist.
No. Causation is causation.
But what criteria one uses at a conclusion of nexus, causation, could differ, Professor.
They will all be unethical, because it would involve giving people cannabis and seeing what happened to them.
Well, what about the legal indicators?
To see if consumption changes.
Well, there are various.
We might disagree on the best way of proving causation, but I don't think any of us would disagree that proving causation would require an experimental.
Something to you, Professor, at this juncture. I think it's time enough now. For the purposes of saving that paper, or the paper that I referred to from the University of Bristol, by the way, Professor Gage, I can't read this, Fors, Burgess and Bowden. You said Maneuver.
Susie Gage? Gage, yes, I know that paper. I know that paper.
So you're aware of Sorry, my lord, I seem to have lost my note that I want to use. Covered a number of statements to you. Each one of them is an attempt to deal with things that you've said in the course of your cross-examination. Sometimes I allude to what you've said. But in this relates to the evidence which Professor Madras will give in your absence, because you won't be here then.
Yes.
So in fairness to you, I need to put this to you. Of course, a lot of it is found in her summary. You've already commented, you've indicated your disagreement with that earlier. Cognitive impairment may persist past 28 days because marijuana may produce by obviously at past 28 days. You agree with that?
No.
You don't agree with that either? No. Marijuana use during adolescence, when the brain is undergoing critical neurodevelopment processes, may produce enduring neurobiological it says. So you do agree with that?
Well, I don't think there's any evidence, but it may. Some people are risk factor, yes.
So it's yes, but you disagree on schizophrenia as a form of psychosis. I've got that.
Yes, I disagree that there's proof it causes schizophrenia.
Marijuana use disorders, known as MUD, are higher among patients Marijuana is associated with increased rates of psychotic relapse, decreased treatment adherence, and poorer psychosocial functioning in patients with schizophrenia. Marijuana is associated with increased rates of, marijuana is associated with decreased treatment adherence. Functioning in
interesting comments in this, or conclusions in this book, and I'll read it out to you, relating to that particular question, is that very relevant to the points you're making here. There is moderate...
Sorry, where
page 303. Conclusion 12.2a. Psychotic disorder can improve aspects of the illness, and it can worsen other aspects. And it is not possible to say it is universally therefore bad.
It's not possible to say it's universally there. It's page
Cognitive functioning. Sorry.
cognitive.
Cognitive functioning.
What I have in my notes here is, and read to you, was psychosocial functioning. Cannabis use risks heart compared to you express in the risk of the heart compared to walking upstairs. An increase in heart.
Yes, but tolerance has developed. It's a good question as to whether the cardiovascular effects, I don't know whether they persist. I imagine they don't persist.
Behavior, lowers risk-taking behavior may have been
Yes, lowers. Yes.
may have been what you said more accurately. In fact, you compared it. You said it's safer than alcohol.
Yes.
There are a number of studies that more than suggest that say that you are wrong, that there's no evidence that cannabis lowers violence. The evidence suggests that cannabis is linked to violence.
Well, I'm not aware of those studies.
I anticipated that you might. As I think you understand, to us on next Wednesday. So you're welcome to let me know those articles are available, well, the articles that we've referenced here. Of course, to the self-limiting nature of cannabis.
Indeed. For many people, the unpleasant effects are the reason they stop using. Those aren't the ones that are getting the paranoia and the panic attacks, though, when they use it.
Who are the ones getting the paranoia and panic attacks?
We don't. Limits their use.
And those who don't stop and continue, it's not something that one can anticipate. It happens or it doesn't happen. That's the nature of psychotic behavior. You said that cannabis was changed back to a Class B drug. Due to pressure from the USA in particular.
Correct.
That do you recall which administration? Was really stood back and witnessed the proliferation of legalization across the states?
I don't think the pressure was coming from Barack Obama. I think, as you well know, the pressure wasn't coming from him, I'm sure, you're right. It was coming from the Drug Enforcement Agency.
But how do they apply pressure on your government? It was Gordon Brown who was your Prime Minister at the time.
On occasions, requests made to me by members of the Foreign Office to change our approach to cannabis because
that administrations pressurize their counterparts, their equals administrations on the other side. And this would be the federal administration.
yes,
Their agency about the Drug Enforcement Agency in relation to states in America, but at a federal level, my point is that it's the administration of Barack Obama who was indifferent. Whatever your information.
well, comply. And I think you could probably find many presidents of many countries to support my statement.
But Mr. David Rains was the instigator of that movement against you. And that public outcry that brought pressure to bear, ultimately, on our equivalent.
Point.
But that's my choice, my lord, whether I do or don't.
Pardon?
That would be my choice, whether I do or don't in due course, my lord. But I've asked the witness to comment. Basis, I haven't heard from Professor Nutt.
Yes. Do you care to answer that question?
Yeah, I'm not entirely clear how this is relevant to why I'm here as an expert witness, going back to alter what they see as appropriate prohibitionary attitudes to drugs. And they certainly are a campaign group. I mean, I think we have the same here, don't we? I mean, this is
your recommendation was. In fact, it wasn't particular to your recommendation, it was particular to statements you had made in the press in your capacity as the chairperson of the advisory committee.
well, there wasn't a public. I mean, there's no way it could be construed as a public outcry. That would be ridiculous.
I will revisit that a little bit later. Your question you posed, maybe rhetorically, I don't know, but what is the relevance of You made a statement that in the USA, cannabis is not really taken with tobacco as in England. Is that a correct recordal of what you said? The poly drug.
Oh, in the UK, the split is usually made up of tobacco and cannabis, whereas my understanding is in the USA.
Give me a moment to consider how to put this to you. I think I should leave that there. I think what is referenced, I think what was understood by your comment, look, so maybe I get clarity. So what you're saying is the habit of mixing cannabis together with tobacco is something unique to England. In other words, within the spliff.
I don't know if reducing an from the smoked tobacco, because smoked tobacco burns at a higher temperature than smoked cannabis. Tobacco is more addictive, and there was a concern when cannabis was more as we reduce the class from B to C. If anything, cannabis use went down, it didn't go up.
So, but do you know for a fact that by not mixing it with marijuana.
Correct, yes. So they mitigate the risk of becoming tobacco dependent because they don't smoke tobacco with marijuana.
So they rather risk.
Tobacco dependent. With cannabis, we've established it's about 8 to 10%. So tobacco is a more addictive drug.
If we think back to the graphs in the 12 to 17-year-old age groups,
Yes.
between
I mean, as I said, people who use drugs use drugs.
they do strange things.
Sorry?
They do strange things.
They use drugs. I mean, you know, and it's people who use drugs often.
Bef-
Correct.
THCV has been isolated and known since the early 1970s, has it not?
It has. Murray has discovered that it may be antipsychotic, but the regulations in Britain are such that not even he can study it without going through the
course of action you opted for. You then spoke of synthetic cannabinoids, saying that they were developed because of prohibition of relatively benign substances. What I want to put to you is that that's pursued.
So the original ambition was, by a number of pharmaceutical companies, to mimic the effects of THC by making new molecules. Then they can be patented and they can be developed as new medicines. So there was a considerable amount of activity in the 1970s to find analogues of and so they dropped them. They were resurrected 10 to 15 years ago when people realized that they could get around as smoking mixtures to allow people to buy legally a cannabis-like substance. The problem is, the same thing happens But the is growing. In some of our prisons, 3/4 of the prisoners are using spice on a regular basis because it cannot be tested for, it cannot be detected when prisoners. Because it is sold in countries where there is extreme prohibition of cannabis, like the United Kingdom.
That's your answer. Professor, I think then we start to entourage effect, or out of a concern for the entourage effect, as you say. It'll take ages and many dollars, and up to 1 billion, you said. The comment on that is contrasting the opposite effect and the same strategy is the rationale approved or approach to investigating cannabinoids in marijuana in the plant. Your comment?
Well, that's $100 billion to test each one. And then if you believe, as there is evidence for, that in combinations they may be better, the entourage value in the and that seems to me pointless when we have enough evidence that the plant itself provides therapeutic value.
Professor, that's your criticism. Do you have any
For putting and therefore, well, so you can do the sums. If there's 100 different drugs, you have to, at the very least, testing every individual component could cost that much.
so there's no hard evidence?
Regardless of brain research developing new medicines. Companies will not do it because it's too expensive, and it takes, on average, 13 years to take a drug
Professor,
from the test tube to the human, and that's why it costs $1 billion. Pharmaceutical past its dates, but has never been appropriate for drugs with complex pharmacology like the cannabis plant. So single products. With the combination of THC and CBD is potentially important in the therapeutic balance. And that's why different disorders. 100 different disorders that cannabis might be helpful for. Testing 2 or 3 different ratios, even of those 2 components of cannabis. No one is going to do it, and therefore there won't be medicines, at least certainly not in my lifetime, and maybe not in the lifetime of anyone in this court, that come from making combinations of the plant cannabinoids. Length. For awarding a marketing authorization for a drug.
That's correct. She does quote that, Professor. But the point is a different one. Go back to...
That there are ways of developing medicines that are compatible with rationality and science that don't health in the world. It is not appropriate for many countries in the world, as I said in my evidence. If you applied FDA criteria, not a single traditional remedy in Africa
years ago. It was acceptable then, but the advent of modern medicine, and because of its understanding of impurities, side effects, pesticides, herbicides, unregulated dosages,
it was a medicine, as far as we know, from the beginnings of recorded history. The decision to take cannabis out of the pharmacopoeia was not a medical decision. Only American pharmaceutical companies to have control of pharmaceutical markets is ridiculous.
that throughout history, scientists and politicians have found themselves in a position of tension, and that when it was removed from the pharmacopoeia, it wasn't without
WHO does no longer has the file, the 1934 file, that gives the reasons why marijuana is not a medicine. They pharmacopoeia. They didn't agree with eliminating cannabis, and that is why it was a medicine in Britain until 1971. And so at the very least, you can say two things. We don't know if the decision to remove
as you said, the evidence is missing. We can't resolve that one here. Professor, then you said that Sativex is an example of a different approach. A category approach.
Well, it's a different approach because it's a spray. It's not a liquid, or it's not, and it's, you know, it's not a pure liquid. It's a spray in alcohol, I believe. So Sativex is this mixture of THC and cannabidiol. It's not clear why they made that mixture, but I imagine it was to minimize side effects. And
whatever the reason was back then, Professor, those are not the drivers of today. Those are not what drive
isn't it interesting that despite repeated requests by its own expert body, the WHO has refused, over 85 years, to review
confirmed her status, but then you made a comment, as I recall, that she'd only written 2 articles and she's not a doctor. You meant she's not a clinician.
No. And what I said was that as far
Well, yesterday I handed to the plaintiff's legal representatives a document that put together a record of documentation, articles, that she speak on cannabis, and certainly in the context of this trial and the evidence that you've given.
well,
Now that you've had regard to that list, my Lord, I'll hand it up to your Lordship in a moment.
Oh, hang on. There's one paper she's published, paper number 5. That's a very recent paper. It only came out this year. I'm not sure if that's a human paper. Could you clarify for me whether that's a human study or a monkey study?
I can't clarify now. I don't know.
Okay, so that's the that's the only study that she has done that is in humans. So she is a primate researcher. She's biochemist, a psychologist. She's not a clinical doctor. And these papers that she has, the other papers she's produced, there are yes, so there are, until the one that's just come out this March, there are, and so I don't believe that was in her CV here. She's only published 2 papers on cannabinoid substances in monkeys. She hasn't researched cannabis in humans at all, as far as I can see, and certainly not in relation to the effects of cannabis and the comparative harms of cannabis. So I have to say my interpretation of her, and looking at her CV, which contains a lot of information as to what she does, she is, like many so-called experts, she has taken a position that cannabis is bad, and she has cannabis prohibition vision about this, but she is not interested in the view of cannabis. Humans. She is in the business of providing data that stop cannabis side have tried to look at comparative harms. She simply rails against cannabis and generates.
Or do you cite?
She
I haven't seen any citation of anyone else's study in your work except your own.
She has none. That are published here.
I know, you missed the question. Does she cite your studies?
I haven't read these papers to know.
You haven't read her papers? Because you made the statement that...
Well, I can see from the titles that they're not particularly relevant to my research.
My Lord, might I hand this up? My Lord, I propose that it be added to the bundle at the back, just behind Professor Madrasa's curriculum vitae. It's file 5, and then I've just, for your Lordship's benefit, put in there capital A 1-16.
That would be in volume?
Volume 2, my Lord. No, I'm wrong. Volume 5, my Lord. It's file 5, yes, volume 5. I think we should all just change our wording, our description.
So you said it's in volume 5?
Yes, thank you, my Lord.
Thank you.
So the pagination, my Lord, just for my learned friends' benefit, AA1 to AA16. I don't take your professor. The first article, cannabinoid and D2.
Would you tell me which cannabinoid?
Cannabinoid receptor agonist and antagonist effect.
The look of the abstract. Have any bearing on what we're talking about in court today?
Next we go to 3.
Is they publish a paper and then they ask experts to write commentaries. They've asked her to write a commentary.
Professor, the only point I want to make In this document, there is a plethora she's an expert, and ultimately whether or not she's a reliable expert. But just with referencing this, in fact, I know it's much longer, but she starts off with an article in So she works in the Department of Psychiatry. I don't think I need to take it much further. It's the only point I want to make.
But the point you're making is to mislead the judge, because not demonstrated any human research on cannabis, and yet she spends vast amounts of her time traveling America, telling people how harmful cannabis is to humans.
Well, at least her government takes her advice, Professor. Yours doesn't.
Lord, with respect. Lord, Mr. Willis is just being insulting and facetious, my Lord. What does that say for the administration of justice?
Mr. Willis.
I'd like the witness to answer that, my Lord. I'm giving him an opportunity.
What was the question?
I said her government at least listens to her. Your government, on your own evidence, doesn't.
Well, I'm just hoping that your government listens to me.
Is that the purpose of your evidence in this court? To apply, to use this forum?
Well, I think...
Allow me to finish, Professor. Is it your intention, has it been your intention to use this forum to be a protagonist for your cause? Or has it been your intention to participate in these proceedings as an expert witness on the issues?
Well, my reason for being here is that I was asked to be an expert witness in a case that was being held in a jurisdiction, not America, where we've ascertained that politics overrules science, not in the UK, where my own history tells you that politics overrules science, but in a country where, hopefully, there is an opportunity through your constitution to allow science its proper place in determining drug policy without political interference. That is why I'm here, because this is potentially the only country in the world that would allow a scientist to have a say in making drug policy.
Thank you, Professor. I'm more than happy with your answer. Lord, if you would bear with me, I don't want to move on to a broader topic. I just want to see what I can do in using the time that is left. Professor, maybe in the time that's available, if you just give me a moment, I just want to check this note that's been handed to me. If I could ask you to turn to file number 2, that's or volume number 2, my Lord. We will make an effort to refer to the files as volumes. That's the one where
Well,
you're
by
expert.
now I understand you refer
You understand me and I
to
understand you.
file with volume.
Thank you.
Distinction without a difference. Page.
You just give me a moment, Lord. I'll try to find my file. If you could go to page 138 in your summary, Professor.